Today I wish to make a brief survey of the rites and orders of Freemasonry, as I agreed to do. Of course, I can only impart to you the main essentials, as the whole subject is so comprehensive and so many inessential things are connected with it. The basis for the whole of Freemasonry is to be found in the temple legend concerning Hiram Abiff, or Adon Hiram, about whom I have already spoken in connection with the Rosicrucian order. Everything to do with what is called the secret of Freemasonry and its tendency is expressed in this temple legend. We are led to a kind of genesis or theory of evolution of the human race. Let us therefore recall to mind the essentials of this temple legend. One of the Elohim united himself with Eve, and out of this union of a divine creative spirit with Eve, Cain was born. Then another of the Elohim, Jehovah or Adonai, created Adam, who is to be regarded as the primal man of the third root race. This Adam then united himself with Eve, and from this union Abel was born. Thus, at the outset of human evolution, there are two starting points. Cain, the direct descendant of one of the Elohim with Eve, and Abel, who with the help of a divinely created human being, Adam, is the true representative of Jehovah. The whole conception underlying the creation story, according to the temple legend, is based upon the fact that there is a kind of enmity between Jehovah and everything that is derived from the other Elohim and their descendants, the, quote, sons of fire, close quote. This being the designation of the descendants of Cain, according to the temple legend. Jehovah creates enmity between Cain and his race, and Abel and his race. The outcome of this was that Cain slew Abel. That is the archenemy, which exists between those who receive their existence from the divine worlds and those who work out everything for themselves. The fact that Abel makes the sacrifice of an animal to Jehovah, while Cain brings the fruits of the earth, is an illustration, which the Bible gives too, of this contrast between the race of Cain and the race of Abel. Cain has to wrest from the earth with hard labor the fruits which are necessary for the sustenance of mankind. Abel takes what is already living, what has been prepared for his livelihood. The race of Cain creates, as it were, the living out of the lifeless. Abel takes up what is already alive, what is already imbued with the breath of life. Abel's sacrifice is pleasing to God, but Cain's is not. Thus we find two kinds of human being characterized in Cain and Abel. The one consists of those who accept what God has prepared for them. The others, the free humanity, are those who till the soil and labor to win living products out of what is lifeless. Those who regard themselves as sons of Cain are they who understand the temple legend and wish to live by it. Out of the race of Cain spring all those who are the creators of the arts and sciences of mankind. Tubal-Cain, who is the first true architect and the god of smithies and working tools, and also Hiram Abiff, or Adon Hiram, who is the hero of the temple legend. This Hiram is sent for by King Solomon, famous for his wisdom, who belongs to the race of Abel, those who receive their wisdom from God. Thus this contrast appears once more at the court of Solomon. Solomon the wise and Hiram the independent worker, who has achieved his wisdom through human striving. Solomon called to his court Balkis, the queen of Sheba, and when she arrived, her impression of him was of a statue made of gold and precious stones. It was as though she were looking at a monument bestowed on mankind by the gods. As she gazed in wonderment at the great temple of Solomon, her desire was to meet the architect of this wonderful building, and her wish was fulfilled. Merely through a single glance which the architect cast on her, she was able to appreciate his true worth. Solomon was immediately seized by a kind of jealousy of Hiram. This grew as Balkis demanded that all the workers engaged in the building of the temple should be presented to her. Solomon declared that this was impossible, but Hiram conceded to her wishes. He climbed onto a slight eminence, made the mystical sign of the Tau, and behold, all the workers streamed toward him. The will of the queen had been fulfilled. Because of this, Solomon is disinclined to oppose the enemies of Hiram and to stand out against them. A Syrian stonemason, a Phoenician carpenter, and a Jewish miner were antagonistic toward Hiram. These three fellow craftsmen had been totally denied the master word by Hiram Abiff. The master word is that which would have enabled them to work independently as master builders. The master word is a secret that is imparted only to those who have made the grade. Therefore they came to the decision to do Hiram some harm. The opportunity for this came about as Hiram Abiff was about to fulfill his masterpiece, the casting of the molten sea. The movement of the waters was to be held fast in form. The surging sea was to be preserved alive, artistically, in a rigid form. That is the point. The three apprentices conspired to make the casting in such a way that instead of flowing into the mold, it would flow out over the surroundings. Hiram tried to arrest the flow of the fiery mass by throwing water over it, but this caused the metal to spray up into the air and descend again with great force in a rain of fire. Hiram was powerless to do anything. But suddenly a voice called out to him, "Hiram, Hiram, Hiram!" He was ordered by the voice to plunge into the sea of fire. This he did, and he sank down ever deeper until he reached the center of the earth, where fire has its origin. There he met two figures, his ancestor Tubal-Cain and Cain himself. Cain was irradiated with the brightness of Lucifer, the angel of light. Then Tubal-Cain gave Hiram his hammer, which had the magical property of restoring all things to their proper order. And he said to him, quote, "You will beget a son who will gather about him a race of wise folk, and you will be the progenitor of those who have been born out of fire, which brings wisdom and makes man thoughtful." Close quote. The molten sea was now restored by means of the hammer. Hiram and Queen Balkis then met again outside the city. She became his wife, but Hiram was unable to avert the jealousy of Solomon and the revenge of the three fellow craftsmen. He was slain by them. The only thing he was able to save was the triangle with the master word engraved upon it, which he threw into a deep well. Then Hiram was buried, and a branch of acacia was planted on his grave. The acacia branch betrayed the whereabouts of the grave to Solomon, and the triangle was also discovered. It was sealed up and buried in a place known to only a few people, 27 in all. It was agreed that the new master word should be the word first uttered after the finding of the corpse. It is the word which is used by the Freemasons. The Freemasons trace back their origin with some justification to the temple legend and to the old days in which the temple was built by Solomon as a lasting memorial to the secret of the fifth root race. And now we have to learn to understand how mankind can benefit by Freemasonry. That is not so easy. A person who gets to know something of the complicated initiation ceremonies of Freemasonry might be inclined to ask, is what takes place in such ceremonies very trivial and petty? I will now describe to you the initiation ceremony of an apprentice wishing to join the order of craft masonry. Just imagine someone has decided that he wants to become a member of the craft masonry. It consists of 3 degrees: apprentice, fellow craftsman, and master mason. After these 3 degrees come higher degrees, which lead the candidate into occult knowledge. I will now describe what happens to a novice about to be initiated into the 1st degree, that is, the degree of apprentice. When he is brought into the lodge building for the first time, he is led into a remote chamber by the brother warden, and left for some minutes to his own thoughts. Then he is deprived of all metal he has about him, such as gold, silver, and other metals. His clothes are rent at the knee, and the heel of his left shoe is trodden down. In this condition, he is led into the midst of the brethren, who are assembled in another room. A cord is passed round his neck, and a sword is pointed at his naked breast. In this state he is confronted by the worshipful master, who asks him if he is still determined to undergo initiation. Then he is cautioned very seriously, and during the further procedures, the meaning of the treading down of the heel and other procedures are explained to him. There are 3 things which he is obliged to forego. If he is unable to forswear these 3 things, he will never be accepted as a Freemason. He is told, if you retain the slightest curiosity about anything, then you must leave this house immediately. Secondly, he is told, if you should hesitate to acknowledge every one of your failings and mistakes, then you must leave this house immediately. Thirdly, if you are unable to rise in spirit above all things which differentiate one human being from another, then you must leave this house immediately. These 3 things are most strictly required from every candidate for initiation. Then a kind of frame is held in front of the candidate, through which he is thrown, while at the same time an unpleasant noise is produced, so that he flies through the frame with the worst of feelings. In addition to this, they shout to him that he is being thrown into hell. At that same instant, a trap door is closed with a bang, and he is given the impression of being in very peculiar surroundings. His skin is then scratched slightly, so that blood is made to flow, and at the same time a gurgling sound is made by those around him, giving him the impression that he is losing a great deal of blood. After that, 3 hammer blows are struck by the worshipful master. What is said thereafter in the lodge must be treated in the strictest secrecy. Were the candidate to reveal it, his connection with Freemasonry would be changed, just as the drink he is offered also changes, sweet from the one side, bitter from the other. This drink is handed to him in an artfully constructed vessel, so that the drink is sweet from one side, but when turned around it changes to bitter. That is to symbolize how it will be for the candidate if he betrays the secrets. After these proceedings, he is led to a flight of stairs in a room which is very dimly lit. This staircase is so constructed that it moves, and thereby gives the impression that one has descended a long way, whereas one has really only descended a short distance. It is the same when the candidate falls. When he thinks he has fallen into a deep well, he has in reality only fallen a very short way. At this point it is explained to him that he has arrived at a decisive moment. In addition to this, he is blindfolded again when he is by the staircase. Then the brother warden is asked, quote, "Brother senior warden, deem you the candidate worthy of forming part of our society?" Close quote. If the answer is yes, he is then further asked, quote, "What do you ask for him?" Close quote. He is obliged to answer, "Light." Then the bandage is removed from the candidate's eyes, and he sees himself in an illuminated chamber. Then follows the basic question, "Do you recognize who is your master?" He makes answer, "Yes, it is he who is wearing a yellow jacket and blue trousers." The blue trousers refer to the rank he possesses. Then he receives the 3 attributes of apprenticeship: sign, grip, and word. The sign is a symbol of the same kind of occult symbols. Readers aside, there's a gap in the text, and a readers aside. The grip is a special kind of hand clasp to be used when shaking hands. These hand clasps are different in the case of an apprentice and in the case of a master. The word changes according to degree. It does not behoove me to reveal what the words are. After that, the person concerned can be admitted to his apprenticeship. On admission, he is asked "How old are you?" he makes answer, "Not yet 7 years." He has to serve 7 years as an apprentice before he can progress to become a journeyman. When someone has progressed so far that he is eligible for his master's degree, the initiation ceremony is somewhat more difficult. The main thing is, however, that what is contained in the temple legend is actually carried out in practice on the candidate himself. He who wishes to attain to the master's degree is led into one of the rooms in the lodge building and has to lie in a coffin, and to undergo the same fate as the master builder Hiram suffered. Then the new sign, grip, and word are revealed to him. The word is the same as the master word, which was uttered at the finding of Hiram's body. The signs by which a master is known are extremely complicated. Recognition is achieved with the help of many forms and gestures. The Freemasonry masters call themselves, quote, "children of the widow," close quote. Thus the company of the masters is directly derived from the Manichaeans. I shall still speak about the connection between Manichaeism and Freemasonry. The task of Freemasonry is connected with that belonging to the whole of the fifth root race. You could, of course, from the point of view of modern rationalist thinking, dismiss all I have told you about the initiation of an apprentice and the various ceremonies connected therewith as mere tomfoolery and play acting. But that is not what it is. All the things I have mentioned are the outward symbolical enactment of ancient occult practices which once took place on the astral plane through the mystery schools. Such proceedings, therefore, which take place symbolically among Freemasons, are carried out on the astral plane in the mystery temples. The initiation into the degree of a master, the lying in the coffin, and so on, is actually something which takes place on a higher level. However, in Freemasonry it only takes place symbolically. One could now ask, where does all this lead? A Freemason should be conscious of the fact that one should act on the physical plane in a way that will maintain a connection with the spiritual worlds. It makes a difference whether one is a member of a community that believes in symbols that help to create a higher community, or whether, readers aside, there's a gap in the text, end of readers aside. A Freemason need not necessarily have different thoughts from the man in the street, but his feelings are quite different. Feelings are connected with symbolical enactments, and it is not a matter of indifference whether or no a feeling of this kind is aroused, because it corresponds with a certain rhythm on the astral plane. The meaning behind the first part of the ceremony, the taking away of metal objects, is that the candidate should not retain about his person anything which he has not produced by his own labors. A feeling for this is necessary for anyone who has had his attention drawn to the significance of symbols. He should also retain an enduring memory of the tearing of the trousers at the knee. He should think upon the fact that he ought to present himself in life as if he were appearing completely naked in the eyes of his fellow men. In like manner, the treading down of the heel should act as a constant reminder that even though he may be strong as far as Freemasonry is concerned, he nevertheless is made vulnerable through his heel of Achilles. All subsequent parts of the ceremony have basically a meaning of this kind, particularly in the case of the eerie feeling which is engendered when a cold, sharp-edged sword is laid against his breast. That is a feeling which persists for a long time and becomes focused in a suggestion which returns to his mind at important moments and reminds him that he should develop a kind of cold-blooded attitude. Cold-bloodedness should be the suggestion he receives. Complete responsibility for his own actions is what is symbolized by the cord laid about his neck, which can be drawn tight at any moment. Presence of mind is suggested by the procedures connected with trapdoors, moving stairways, etc. Those are procedures which take place quite differently in the mysteries, because they are performed on the astral plane. The candidate must then take the oath. Everything about him is horrible, dark, the room only lit by 1 or 2 tiny flames. I want you to consider this oath in its full portent. Quote, I hereby swear that by word, sign, and grip I shall never disclose anything which is henceforth revealed to me within this lodge. Should I betray any of the secrets, I will allow any of the brethren who may get to know about it to slit my throat and wrench out my tongue. Close quote. That is the oath of the apprentice. Still more dreadful is the oath of the journeyman, who consents to have his breast cut open and his heart torn out and thrown to the birds. The oath which the master has to swear is so terrible that it cannot be repeated here. These things are used as a means of evoking a certain kind of rhythm in the sensations of the astral body. The result of this is that the spirit is influenced intuitively. This influencing of the spirit was the main purpose of the Masonic initiation in ancient times. Freemasonry is really very ancient. The Freemasons of old were actually stone masons. They performed all the duties of a mason. They were the builders of temples and public buildings in ancient Greece, where they were known as Dionysiacs. The building work was carried out in the service of the temple of Dionysus. In Egypt they were the builders of the pyramids, in ancient Rome the builders of cities, and during the Middle Ages they built cathedrals and churches. After the 13th century they also began to build independently of the authority of the Church. At this time the expression, in quotes, Freemason, came into use. Before that they were under the authority of the religious communities and were the recognized architects. Let us take our start from the fact that the Freemasons were the builders of the pyramids, of the mystery temples, and of the churches. You will easily gain the conviction, especially by reading Vitruvius, that the manner in which architecture was formerly studied is quite different from our present method. One did not study it at that time by making calculations, but instead definite intuitions were imparted by means of symbols. If you read in title Lucifer how the Lemurians developed their building capacity, you will get an inkling of the way in which this art was then practiced. It is not possible today to build in that manner. With amazement and wonder we behold the buildings of the ancient Chinese and of the Babylonians and Assyrians, and know that they were constructed without a knowledge of our present-day mathematics. We behold the wonderful engineering feat of Lake Meris in Egypt, a lake which was constructed to collect water which could be diverted into irrigation channels in times of need. It was not built with our modern engineering techniques. The wonderful acoustic effects produced in old buildings were achieved in a way which modern architects are not yet able to imitate. At that time men were able to build by means of intuitive faculties, not through rational understanding. The whole of this kind of architecture stood in relationship to a knowledge of the universe. If you take the Egyptian pyramids, for instance, their measurements correspond to certain measurements in heavenly space, to the distances of the stars in space. The whole configuration of stellar space was depicted in these buildings. There was a connection between the individual building and the dome of heaven. The mysterious rhythm presented to our gaze when we behold the starry heavens, parenthesis, not just with our outer sense, but with an intuitive gaze which penetrates to higher relationships, to rhythmical relationships, close parenthesis, that was what the original architects included in their building, because they were building out of the universe. This art of building was taught in a fashion as different from our own as the teaching of the art of medicine among certain primitive tribes today differs from our own. Our teaching today stems from the intellect. In primitive tribes, the doctor is not trained like our doctors, but has certain occult forces developed in him. He has to undergo a bodily training that would be horrible for anybody of a nervous or weak disposition living in our modern culture. This training teaches him indifference to joy and pain, and he who is indifferent to these is already in possession of occult powers. The extent to which the astral body could originally be trained was so great that it led to the development of powers which were designated as the royal art, which is an art derived from the mighty symbols of heavenly proportions. Now you will have an idea of what Freemasonry used to be, and you will realize that it had to outgrow its real task. It was bound to lose its significance as the world became rationalistic. It had its meaning when the fourth cultural epoch was still being developed. The fifth epoch brought about the loss of its importance. Today, Freemasons are no longer Masons. Anybody can become a member. For occultists, symbols have a real meaning. A symbol that is merely a symbol, merely a copy or image, has no meaning. There is only significance in what can become a reality, in what can become a living force. If a symbol acts upon the spirit of humanity in such a way that intuitive forces are set free, then we are dealing with a true symbol. Today, Freemasons say they have symbols which mean this or that. An occult symbol, however, is one which takes hold of the will and leads over into the astral body. Inasmuch as our culture has become an intellectual culture, Freemasonry has lost its meaning. Regarding connections with Manichaeism, readers aside, there's a gap in the text. End of readers aside. And after that come the high degrees, which extend as far as the 19th, indeed the 96th degree, and start at the 4th degree. The importance of the first 3 degrees has gradually been transferred to the high degrees. There is a kind of residue still remaining in what is called the Royal Arch, which is still extant in Freemasonry today. About these lighter sides and some of the darker sides of Freemasonry, we shall have to speak again. Last time I spoke about Freemasonry, and today I wish to add something to that. I should like you to consider that I am in a different position with regard to Freemasonry than to the other subjects we have spoken about, or which we still intend to discuss, as I usually only speak about things of which I have personal experience. In the present instance, I should stress to you that I am speaking to you as a non-Mason, and only from a theosophical point of view, whereas, to do full justice to the subject of what Freemasonry really is, it should be treated by one who is himself a Freemason. He would not do this, but this is for other reasons, which it is best not to discuss. At the same time, I would request that you treat what I have to say with reserve. When I said to you that only a Freemason himself could speak about what it really represents in its innermost core, so I would beg you to take into account that, in spite of that, there is probably no such Freemason in existence in the whole of Europe. This may strike you as odd, but it is so. Since the 18th century, Freemasonry has been in a very peculiar stage of its development. And I would ask you to regard everything I told you about it last time as being applicable to what it probably would have been like if it had remained as it was in the 16th or 17th centuries. As this is not the case, Freemasonry is, so to speak, only a kind of husk, devoid of its true content. It can be compared to a petrified plant which is no longer the same as what constituted the plant, but is a crust or shell made up by something else. The ordinary craft masonry does not come into consideration where the things we are going to discuss are concerned. For this craft masonry, with its 3 degrees of apprentice, journeyman, and master, took its start from the Charter of Köln in 1535. Today it is not really anything more than a union for mutual stimulation with regard to higher education and schooling, a union for the purpose of mutual support and stimulation among its members. It is true that these first 3 degrees are, as it were, only the last remaining vestiges of the original 3 degrees of Freemasonry. And if the ceremonies were to take place as in former times, which they do not, then apprentice, journeyman, and master would be initiated in the way I described last time. The regulations are certainly that they should take place in this way, but only a few people know that these regulations exist, and still fewer know the meaning of these things. Everything I have told you about the effect of these ceremonies on the astral plane is something of which craft masonry has no clear understanding. Now, both the British and also the St. John lodges in Germany possess these 3 degrees which I have named, and they are actually all in the same state as I have just described. But the possibility is there within these 3 degrees, through the very fact that the symbols exist, of penetrating through them to the deeper wisdom which underlies them. A proof of this is provided by the fact that a Mason whom you all know well by name has addressed his brother Masons in such a way that the germ of his theosophical awareness is thereby revealed, that he was able in a certain sense to speak in theosophical terms to an audience of Masons. The Freemason of whom I speak is Goethe. As theosophists, you will immediately find something very familiar when I read to you 2 verses of his Freemasonry poem, which he intended for his brethren of the lodge. Quote, "Yet call from beyond the voices of spirits, the voices of masters. Omit not to practice the powers of the good. Crowns here are woven in quiet, eternal, rewarding with plenty those who are active. We beg you, have hope." Close quote. Goethe speaks here of the masters, and he speaks of them within the precincts of the lodge, in spite of the fact that he knows that those sitting around him have no inkling of the profundity of his words, because he is also aware of the fact that through the atmosphere which surrounds a Freemasonry lodge, through the presence of symbols, vibrations are set in motion which influence the astral body, and thereby bring about a certain result. That is something which scarcely enters into the consciousness of Freemasons, but upon which those who know can still build today. Those who are led beyond the first 3 degrees to the higher degrees possess rather more consciousness. The first of these higher degrees is the Royal Arch degree, the degree of royal art. This degree is distinguished by the fact that its chapter or union has a special organization, which is filled with deeper meaning. In their gatherings, especially in those in which a new member is to be initiated into the secrets, never more than 12 fellow members are allowed to be present, so that, after the manner of occult brotherhoods, they really represent something other than themselves, something which lives among them in a mysterious fashion. They are not regarded just as persons, but as the personification of particular qualities. The first, who represents the most important in the circle of 12, is called Zerubbabel. He is a leader, the sun, S-U-N, from whom radiates the light which is to illuminate the others. He must needs be the cleverest and has to have a certain knowledge of the essence and meaning of the secret sciences. That is seldom the case with present fashions in the Royal Arch degree. I am talking about an ideal situation, in fact which only very rarely arises, when suitable people happen to be present. The next officer is Jeshua, the high priest. The third, Haggai, the prophet. Together with Zerubbabel, these 3 compose the Grand Council. The first and second principals come next, then the 2 scribes, Ezra and Nehemiah, and the janitor, or tiler, without the door. After that come the so-called lesser companions. Not more than 12 people may be present at any time. These 12 represent the 12 signs of the zodiac. The whole is a portrayal of the sun's passage through the 12 signs of the zodiac. That reminds us of what I told you about the Masons having taken their start in reproducing astronomical laws in particular buildings, in churches, cathedrals, etc. The arrangement of the lodge, though this is not always the case, is a large square hall with a vaulted ceiling, painted blue, and covered with golden stars to represent the heavens. The positions taken up by the participants is closely prescribed by ceremony. The novices, who are last to enter, take their places in the north, as they are not yet able to endure warmth. In the east stands Zerubbabel. In the west is the high priest Jeshua and the prophet Haggai. Readers aside, I'm pronouncing Haggai as Haggai. I apologize if that's wrong. End of readers aside. And those who take their places in the south are roped together. Each of them has the rope wound around him 3 times, uniting him with his fellows at a distance of 3 or 4 decimeters. He who is initiated into this 4th degree, the first of the higher degrees, which in certain regions still provides an inkling of the significance of the temple legend, has to pass 3 veils. At each passing of a veil, one of the secrets is imparted to him. He is told the secret meaning of a particular verse from the Pentateuch. After this, the secret of the Tau sign is explained, and the Holy Word, the Master Word, is given him, which is the word by which Masons of the 4th degree recognize one another. And then, before all else, it is made clear to him in his first instruction how ancient Freemasonry is. The craft Masons do not usually get to know that, or if they do hear it, they have not the slightest understanding of these matters. The history of Freemasonry is related to them in the following way. The first true Mason was Adam, the first man, who had an extraordinary knowledge of geometry at the time of his expulsion from paradise. He was recognized as the first Mason, because, being the first man, he was a direct descendant of the light. The true, deeper origin of Freemasonry, however, predates humanity entirely. It resides in light itself, which existed before mankind. That is most profound, and reveals, for those who can understand it, what theosophical wisdom has again made public through its description of the formation of the earth through the first 2 root races and into the 3rd, the time of Lemuria. Whoever can apprehend this through Freemasonry has received into himself something of tremendous importance. But that takes place in only the rarest cases, because Freemasonry is, as it were, degenerate today. This has come about because since the 16th century, man has had little understanding of the true meaning of Freemasonry, namely, that a temple has to be built in such a way that its proportions are a reflection of the great cosmic proportions, that a cathedral has to be built in such a way that its acoustics reproduce something of the harmony of the spheres, which is the source of all acoustics in the outer world. A knowledge of this original insight was gradually lost. Thus it came about that when Desagulaires, readers aside, apologize for the pronunciation, Desagulliers, Desagulaires, and the readers aside, reunited Freemasonry in England during the first half of the 18th century, no one had any proper understanding of the fact that the word Freemasonry had to be taken literally, that it really did concern the work of the practicing Mason, and that the Mason was one who built churches and temples and other great buildings according to cosmic laws, and incorporated into them heavenly and not earthly proportions. This original insight and its reflection in Freemasonry was lost. There was no longer any conscious appreciation of the transformation wrought by a proper use of acoustics in a building where the speaker's words are thrown back and are thereby changed in their effect. Those who built the great cathedrals of medieval times were the great Freemasons. They were aware of the importance of the fact that what was spoken by the priest should be reflected back from the individual walls, and the whole congregation immersed in a sea of sound, breathing and fluctuating in significant vibration, which would exercise still greater effect on the astral body than on the physical ear. That has all been lost, and it was inevitable that this should be so in the New Age. That is what I meant when I told you that what is left of Freemasonry is only the husk of what it was in former times. Apart from these 3 degrees, there are also the higher degrees, and those are possessed in a fairly complete form by the larger communities of Great Britain, America, Italy, Egypt, and also by Eastern Freemasonry, especially that known as Oriental or Memphis Masonry. In Germany, where there is a branch of the Memphis Mizraim Freemasonry with worldwide Masonic connections, the higher degrees are also functioning. But in Germany, within the St. John Freemasonry, there is so little understanding of the real significance of the higher degrees that the St. John Masons there generally look upon the higher degrees as nonsense. The Grand Orient of Germany is obliged, for this reason, merely to let the St. John Masons in general pass properly as Masons. In this respect, there are great differences between the Masonry practiced in Germany and that of England or Great Britain. In British Masonry, a kind of reconciliation has been achieved through the Articles of Union of 1813 between Craft Masonry, with its 3 degrees, and those branches of Masonry that recognize the higher degrees. Thus, as an apprentice in Craft Masonry, one is allowed to enter and also graduate into the 4th, 5th, and 6th degrees, that is, into the higher degrees. The degrees pertaining to Craft Masonry are credited to one in England. That is not the case in Germany. The German Grand Orient of the Memphis and Mizraim order undertakes the working of the 3 lowest degrees itself. The Orient Freemason must therefore have passed the first 3 degrees at the outset. He must furthermore commit himself to rising at least to the 18th degree. He may not rest until he has done so. A German Mason of the St. John's order is therefore never admitted to the higher degrees of Orient Masonry without having attained the 3 lesser degrees. The Orient Masonry consists of a graded instruction in occultism. As I said last time, it gives a picture of the teaching given in the higher degrees, those which succeed the Royal Arch degree. These provide a kind of astral training which leads up to the 18th or 20th degrees. Then comes that which provides a kind of mental training, a training which leads to a kind of life on the mental plane and advances to the 60th or 70th degree. Lastly comes the highest training of all, the most profound occult instruction, which can be undertaken in the Grand Orient up to the 96th degree. There are only very few in Germany who have advanced to the 96th degree, but in spite of everything, there is something in all this which will presently prove to you how little is left in present-day Masonry of what it formerly encompassed. The most interesting point is that those who have progressed to the 96th degree have not always been through a Masonic training, and that there is scarcely anyone at all who has completed the whole gamut of the training. There are indeed a few who have higher degrees. They have been invested with the 3rd or the 33rd or the 96th degree, but those who possess these distinctions have not gained them through Masonic training, but through other occult institutions, and they have allowed their knowledge to be used to bring about the redemption of Freemasonry. If someone has attained to the 96th degree, it has not been achieved through Masonic training. Bluntly, it is considered that in this respect Freemasonry is indebted to the occult training of other schools. In this sense, we have to interpret the manifesto which has been given by the Grand Orient of the Memphis and Mizraim Rite as a kind of ideal document. I will read it to you with 1 or 2 explanations. What is given here must not be construed as though it could be put into practice in the present day. It must be pointed out today that no Freemason, not even one who has the 96th degree, would take responsibility for taking another Freemason through these prescriptions, since he himself has not undergone them. Quote, "Concerning the secrets of the higher occult degrees of our order, a manifesto of the Grand Orient. One of the secrets belonging to the highest degree of our order consists in providing the appropriately conditioned brother with the practical means of erecting the true temple of Solomon within man, of restoring the lost word. That is, our order provides the initiated and selected brother with practical means, enabling him to gain proof of pure immortality during his present earthly life." Close quote. That is one of the points that are of utmost importance. The next point is one that exists in all centers of occult training. No calling up of spirits or spiritualistic activities. Anyone who practices spiritualism is strictly excluded. Quote, "This secret is one of the true Masonic secrets, and rests solely in the possession of the higher occult degrees of our order. It has been handed down by word of mouth in our order from the ancestors of all true Freemasons, the wise men of the East, and will only be transmitted by us in like manner." Close quote. Steiner again. That is the practice in occult societies. Quote, "Naturally, however, the success of this practical instruction for the attainment of this secret again depends entirely on the candidate himself. For of what use are the best and most tested and detailed instructions given to a candidate wishing to learn to swim, if he is not himself prepared to move hands and feet when he comes into contact with the water? Or of what use is the most comprehensive guidance in learning to paint, or the exposition of the most vivid colors by way of example, if the candidate to whom painting is being taught will not take the paintbrush into his own hand and seek to mix the colors himself? He will never become an artist unless he does so. Those brothers, the discoverers of this secret, guarded it as a rare, self-acquired possession, and in order not to be misjudged or even derided by the man in the street, they concealed it by means of symbols, as we do to this day." Close quote. These symbols are no longer decipherable for the Freemason of the present day. Such symbols are not arbitrarily chosen. These are not things by means of which someone can portray something, like a professor who says, "I will illustrate this graphically." These symbols have been taken from the objects themselves, which have been engraved by nature. He who recognizes them for what they are, who can really read what they contain, comes into contact with their innermost being. He is led by them into their inner nature. These symbols portray the thing itself and do not have a merely symbolical meaning. Within Freemasonry, there is no one who is able to give guidance that would enable a person to arrive at the object itself. Quote, "These symbols are, however, no arbitrary chosen pictures, and they do not rest upon any chance occurrence, but are founded on the attributes of God and of man, and must be regarded as archetypal. But we will never take the form, the vessel, the ritual, the symbols for their content, but will seek the spiritual content within the form." Close quote. These words show, readers aside, there's a gap in the text, end of readers aside, for the symbol itself portrays the object. Quote, "And when we have found this, the spiritual content, and have absorbed it into ourselves, we shall recognize through this spiritual content the absolute necessity of the form, the ritual, the symbolism. Our higher degrees themselves provide the brother with certain proof of the immortality of man." Close quote. Steiner again. "This they would do if they were worked." Quote again. "That is and has been the great longing of mankind ever since human beings who could reason existed. Mankind needs to have this assurance of a life after death in order to be truly happy in this present life. Therefore all the mysteries contained in the religions and centers of hidden wisdom have occupied themselves with this question as their highest and principal task. The Church has naturally also occupied itself with this question of the lost word, the lost immortality. But it directs the candidate along the path of grace, and portrays it as a gift from above, and not as something to be achieved by personal effort. Our order, however, places it within the power of each individual seeker, by practical means, to unite himself consciously and voluntarily with the world consciousness, with the ultimate forces of creation. Close quote. That means, therefore, to provide insight into and union with that world, which otherwise is only accessible through the portal of death. From all this you may draw the conclusion that what belongs to the world's profundities was once found in Freemasonry, but is no longer there in the empty husk which it presents today. You must ask yourselves why. Now the meaning of the temple legend, the meaning of operative masonry, like all intuitive knowledge, had to be lost to humanity, because the fifth cultural epoch is actually the epoch of understanding. Intuition had for a time to lie dormant in the world, and Freemasonry is intuitive in its whole attitude and manner. I would like to draw your attention to Vitruvius and to the true symbolical building instructions that he gave. Only those, however, who have the right intuition for it can follow these instructions. Today, these symbolical instructions have been replaced by intellectual, rational ones. Reason had to become the keynote of man's development for a while, because everything that has meanwhile come to us through great conquests of nature must be incorporated in the whole organism of human activity. Understand what it means. The whole of the mineral kingdom will be included in the progress of the world during the present round of evolution. It will be included in such a way that man will gradually transform the whole of nature through his own spirituality. That is the meaning of the molten sea, that the whole of mineral nature will effectively be transformed. Man works in industry so as to weave organization, his own spirituality, in brackets is a question about, readers aside, about the continuity here, and a readers aside, into mineral nature. If you consider a machine, and readers aside, there's a gap in the text again, and a readers aside. In this way, man thus works the whole mineral kingdom back and forth with his own spirit. This recasting of nature, this recasting of what is mineral, will be perfected when our present round of evolution has come to an end. The whole of mineral nature will then have been changed. Man will have put his stamp on it, just as he imprints his stamp on a quantity of metal when, for example, he fashions a watch. Thus, when a new round of evolution begins, the mineral kingdom can be sucked in, absorbed. In order completely to finish the development in this sphere, the whole way of thinking that has gripped man since the 16th century must be carried right into the atom. Thus, only when reasoned thinking can grasp the atom can Freemasonry again revive. In the first stage, the outer form will be grasped. The next step will be when man has learned to think right into the mineral atom, when he has an understanding of how to make use of what lives in the atom and place it in the service of the whole. It is true that only now, and perhaps only during the last 5 years, human thinking has turned to tracing natural forces as far as the atom. And indeed, he who would understand this precisely must follow the latest phase of the various developments in electricity. The speech which the English Prime Minister Balfour has made on the subject of our contemporary world outlook is interesting in this connection, albeit only in its outward implications. What he said there about new electrical theory is something of enormous importance. He hints at the critical turning point in the development of man's thinking. He is, to a certain extent, conscious of this, and mentions it in one part of his speech. Thus we see how something is dawning in the consciousness of natural science, which plays into the future. This has been known to occultists since 1879. I emphasize this, although I cannot prove it. The occultist knows that this will come about, a new point of departure from the atom into the mineral physical world. That will be what will enter into the world in the sixth cultural epoch, and through this, Freemasonry will also be regenerated. In Freemasonry, the occultist has something very remarkable, something unprecedented, for it has something primeval in its foundation. It belongs to the most ancient of traditions, which has preserved almost 100 degrees in a precisely specialized structure, in spite of the fact that it has lost nearly all of its content, and that none of those belonging to it in Europe are able to form an adequate conception of it. But still, the thing is there, and one will only need to fill the whole outer husk with new content. The thing is there, waiting to be brought to life again. Now there's some points from the subsequent discussion. Steiner, Rites of Memphis, Oriental Rites, and Grand Orient Rites. A conference of occultists discussed whether the occult doctrine could be made public or not. From that it became clear that there are two tendencies, a left and a right tendency, one which is free-thinking and one which is conservative. It is important that we should speak about the higher degrees of Freemasonry, because this manner of instruction sets itself special tasks, certain aspects of which will be discussed in the near future. We are dealing in the main with a special rite that is called the Combined Rite of Memphis and Mizraim. I have already mentioned that the Memphis and Mizraim rite possesses a great number of degrees, that 95 degrees must be undertaken, and that usually the supreme leaders of the Grand Orients, that is, those of Germany, Great Britain, and America, possess the 96th degree. These degrees are so arranged that up to the end of about the 80th to 89th degree, they are divided up in the way I shall presently describe to you. From about the 87th degree onward start the real occult degrees, into which no one can be initiated who has not made a thorough study of the subject. I always make the reservation that in Europe there is nobody who has undertaken all these degrees, or who has really undergone an occult Freemasonry training. But that is of no particular concern as far as Freemasonry goes, because its renewed task still awaits it in the future. And when the time comes, the organization will be available. The vessel will be there, which is needed to carry out what has to be achieved. Now I must mention the various branches of Freemasonry and their tendencies, even if I am only to indicate something briefly. First of all, it is to be borne in mind that the whole of the Masonic higher degrees trace back to a personality often spoken about, but equally very much misunderstood. He was particularly misunderstood by 19th century historians, who have no idea of the difficult situations an occultist can meet in life. This personality is the ill-famed and little understood Cagliostro, the so-called Count Cagliostro, in whom an individuality was concealed, who was recognized in his true nature only by the highest initiates, attempted originally to bring Freemasonry to in London to a higher stage. For during the last third of the 18th century, Freemasonry had fairly well reached the state that I have described. He did not succeed in London at that time. He then tried in Russia, and also at The Hague. Everywhere he was unsuccessful for very definite reasons. Then, however, he was successful in Lyon, forming an occult Masonic lodge of the Philalethes, searchers after truth, out of a group of local Masons, which was called the Lodge of Triumphing Wisdom. Readers aside, Philalethes, possibly, I'm going to pronounce it that way, it's spelled Philalethes, Philalethes. End of reader's aside. The purpose of this lodge was specified by Cagliostro. What you can read about it is, however, nothing but the work of ignorant people. What can be said about it is only an indication. Cagliostro was concerned with two things. Firstly, with instructions enabling one to produce the so-called philosopher's stone. Secondly, with creating an understanding of the mystic pentagram. I can only give you a hint of the meaning of these two things. They may be treated with a deal of scorn, but they are not to be taken merely symbolically. They are based on real facts. The philosopher's stone has a specific purpose, which was stated by Cagliostro. It is meant to prolong human life to a span of 5,527 years. To a free thinker, that appears laughable. In fact, however, it is possible, by means of special training, to prolong life indefinitely by learning to live outside the physical body. Anyone, however, who imagined that no death, in the conventional sense of the word, could strike down an adept, would have quite a false view of the matter. So whoever imagined that an adept could not be hit and killed by a falling roof slate would also be wrong. To be sure, that would usually only occur if the adept allowed it. We are not dealing here with physical death, but with the following. Physical death is only an apparent occurrence for him who has understood the significance of the philosopher's stone for himself, and has learned to exteriorize it. For other people, it is a real happening, which signifies a great division in their life. For he who understands how to use the philosopher's stone in the way that Cagliostro intended his pupils to do, death is only an apparent occurrence. It does not even constitute a decisive turning point in life. It is in fact something which is only there for the others who can observe the adept and say that he is dying. He himself, however, does not really die. It is much more the case that the person concerned has learned to live without his physical body, that he has learned during the course of life to let all those things take place in him gradually that happen suddenly in the physical body at the moment of death. Everything has already taken place in the body of the person concerned, which otherwise takes place at death. Death is then no longer possible, for the said person has long ago learned to live without the physical body. He lays aside the physical body in the same way that one takes off a raincoat, and he puts a new body on just as one puts on a new raincoat. Now, that will give you an inkling. That is one lesson which Cagliostro taught, the philosopher's stone which allows physical death to become a matter of small importance. The second lesson was the knowledge of the pentagram. That is the ability to distinguish the 5 bodies of man one from another. When someone says physical body, etheric body, astral body, kama, manas body, causal body, bracket, higher manas or spirit self, close bracket, these are mere words, or at best, abstract ideas. Nothing, however, is achieved by that. A person living today as a rule hardly knows the physical body. Only one who knows the pentagram learns to know the 5 bodies. One does not know a body by living in it, but by having it as an object. That is what distinguishes an average person from one who has gone through such a schooling that the 5 bodies have become objects. The ordinary person does indeed live in these 5 bodies. However, he lives in them. He cannot step outside of himself and look at them. At best, he can view his physical body when he looks down at his torso or sees it in a mirror. Those pupils of Cagliostro who had followed his methods would thereby have achieved what some Rosicrucians achieved who had basically undergone a training with the same orientation. They were in a school of the great European adepts who taught that the 5 bodies were realities and not mere concepts. That is called knowing the pentagram and, in quotes, moral rebirth. I will not say that the pupils of Cagliostro never achieved anything. In general, they went as far as comprehending the astral body. Cagliostro was extremely skillful in imparting a view of the astral body. Long before the catastrophe broke over him, he had succeeded in starting schools in Paris, Belgium, St. Petersburg, and a few other places in Europe, in addition to the one in Lyon, out of which later emerged at least a few people who had the basis for some to proceed to the 18th, 19th, and 20th higher degrees of Freemasonry. Thus Count Cagliostro at least had an important influence on occult masonry in Europe before ending his days in the prison in Rome. The world should not actually pronounce judgment on Cagliostro. As I have already indicated, when people speak about Cagliostro, it is as the Hottentots were to speak about the erection of an overhead railway, because the relationship of apparently immoral outward acts to world happenings is not understood. I remarked earlier that the French Revolution arose out of the secret societies of the occultists, and if these currents were investigated further, they would lead back to the school of the adepts. It may be that what Mabel Collins depicted in her novel Flitta is hard to understand. In it she describes rather grotesquely how an adept has the world chessboard in front of him in a secret place and lets the pieces play, and how he, so to speak, controls the karma of a continent upon one very simple little board. It does not quite take place as it is described there, but something on a much greater scale than that does actually happen, of which what is described as Flitta gives only a distorted picture. Now, the French Revolution certainly proceeded from such things as this. There is a well-known story contained in the writings of the Countess Dodemar, It related that before the outbreak of the French Revolution, the Countess Dodemar, one of the ladies-in-waiting to Marie Antoinette, received a visit from the Count of Saint-Germain. He wanted to be presented to the Queen and to beg audience of the King. Louis XVI's minister, however, was the enemy of the Count of Saint-Germain, who therefore was not allowed into the King's presence. But he described to the Queen with great accuracy and detail the major perils that were looming ahead. Regrettably, however, his warnings were ignored. It was on that occasion that he uttered the great saying, which was based on truth, quote, "They who sow the wind shall reap the whirlwind," close quote. And he added that he had uttered this saying millennia previously, and it had been repeated by Christ. Those were words which were unintelligible to the ordinary person. But the Count of Saint-Germain was right. I will only add a few more touches which are quite correct. In books about the Count of Saint-Germain, you can read that he died in 1784 at the court of the Landgrave of Hessen, who later became one of the most advanced German Freemasons. The Landgrave nursed him until the end. But the Countess Dodemar recounts in her memoirs that he appeared to her long after the year 1784, and that she saw him 6 more times long after that. In reality, he was at that time in 1790 with some Rosicrucians in Vienna, and said, which is perfectly true, that he was obliged to retire to the Orient for the span of 85 years, and that after that time people would again become aware of his activity in Europe. The year 1875 is that of the founding of the Theosophical Society. These things are all connected together in a certain way. In the school founded by the Landgrave of Hessen, also there were 2 main concerns, the Philosopher's Stone and the knowledge of the pentagram. The Freemasonry founded by the Landgrave of Hessen at that time continued to exist in a rather diluted form. In fact, the whole of Freemasonry, as I have described it, is called the Egyptian Rite, the Rite of Memphis and Mizraim. The latter traces its origin back to King Mizraim, who came from Assyria, from the Orient, and after the conquest of Egypt was initiated into the Egyptian mysteries. These are indeed the mysteries which originate from ancient Atlantis. An unbroken tradition exists from that time. Modern Freemasonry is only a continuation of what was established then in Egypt. Before I go into details, I would like to say that Freemasonry, which extends to the higher degrees, is something which, in its more intimate aspect, is quite different from the normal craft masonry. The ordinary craft masonry rests on a kind of democratic principle, and if the democratic principle is to be applied to matters of knowledge, it is obvious that it will lead to a state of affairs in which the brothers who have congregated together will mainly do nothing but bring forward their own views. Truth, however, is something about which one cannot hold one's own views. One either knows a truth or one is ignorant of it. No one can say that the three angles of a triangle add up to 725 degrees instead of to 180 degrees. When people sit together and have a discussion, they talk about their own views, sometimes also about the most elevated things. But all of this exists on the level of illusion, and is just as irrelevant as what a person says who is ignorant of the true sum of the angles of a triangle, and only gives his own opinion about it. Just as one is unable to discuss whether the sum of the angles of a triangle have this or that many degrees, so one is also unable to have a discussion about higher truths. That is why the democratic principle is not applicable to matters of knowledge, for there is no basis of argument on which to discuss them. What distinguishes Masonry from the higher degrees, what distinguishes Masonry of the higher degrees from the craft Masonry, is that one learns to know the truth step by step. Whoever has recognized a thing can no longer hold more than one opinion about it. One has either recognized it or one has not done so. The 96 degrees have, therefore, a certain justification. At the head is the so-called sovereign sanctuary, who is identical with what is known as the Grand Orient in Freemasonry, and is in possession of the real occult knowledge. He knows the path and the speech of that which can be read in the Masonic Manifesto, and which makes it possible to hear the voice of the wise men of the East. When he has reached this step, he is certainly in a position to hear the voice of the wise masters. So far, however, must one have worked one's way up that one is in possession of very definite knowledge, and also of definite inner qualities and inner capacities, which are by no means purely covered by the conventional bourgeois virtues, but are something more meaningful and intimate. I would note that compared with what we have been speaking about here, what theosophical literature reveals of a theoretical or practical nature forms only an elementary part, so that the theoretical side of the higher degrees of Freemasonry far surpasses what can be divulged in popular theosophy. What can be disclosed there is dependent upon the permission given by the adepts who allow these things to be popularized to a certain degree, but it is not possible to make all knowledge public. It is correct to say that humanity will be astonished by some of the discoveries that will be made in the near future. But they will be rather premature discoveries, and will therefore cause some havoc. The task of the Theosophical Society consists mainly in preparing people for such things. For instance, what I described at the beginning as the knowledge of the Philosopher's Stone was formerly much more universally known than it is today, and indeed it was known already during a certain period of the Atlantean epoch. At that time, the possibility of conquering death was really something which was commonly known. I only wish to remark that I was not very happy about allowing this truth to appear in print recently. Therefore, where this should have come in the discussion about Atlantean times in the Lucifer article, a row of dots was printed in place of those things which may not yet be communicated. It cannot even yet be communicated in its entirety. There is a very similar piece of information recorded by a very advanced medium, which appeared in the title Theosophical Review, dealing with exactly the same thing in a rather different form. The overcoming of death in Atlantean times is naturally preserved in the memories of the individuals concerned without their being aware of it. There are many people reincarnated today who passed through that period in their former lives and who are led to such revelations through their own memories. That will first of all lead to a kind of overrating of certain medical discoveries. People will imagine that medical science was the discoverer of such things. In reality, people will have been led to them through their own memories of Atlantean times. Certain things will mature in the near future, and therefore we shall speak about them. This makes it necessary to see the need of a step-by-step advance in the gaining of knowledge. This step-by-step advance is therefore rightly emphasized by those who wish to revive the Mizraim and Memphis rite at the present time. Even if this does not succeed during the next year or two, one must not think that failure in such things is of any significance. There is a man at the head of the American Mizraim movement whose significant character constitutes a sure guarantee of constancy in the advance. This is the excellent Freemason John Yarker. It is difficult to say at the moment what form the matter will take in Great Britain and Germany. You will perceive that one must reckon with the human material concerned, and that the German movement, therefore, if it is to concern itself with such matters, will also have to reckon with what is available in this direction. If genuine occultists are to take part in such things, they must needs be active in one or other direction. They will not always be able to take part in such things. Even the masters, when they prescribe something of this kind, have to take their cue from great universal laws. If, therefore, you hear something concerning the German Mizraim-Memphis tendency, you should not imagine that this now has significance for the future. It is only the frame into which a good picture may later be put. This German Mizraim order stands under the overall guidance of a certain Reuss, who holds the actual leadership in Great Britain and Germany today. Then the well-known Karl Kellner also works in this direction. The actual literary work is in the hands of Dr. Franz Hartmann, who serves the Mizraim rite with his pen to the very utmost. That is as much as I can impart to you in this or that fragment from here or there concerning this movement. Now I can only characterize what is involved here in general terms. There are 4 kinds of instruction given in the Mizraim rite. The 96 degrees can therefore be achieved through 4 different kinds of instruction or disciplines. These 4 disciplines, by means of which one advances, are the following. First, the so-called symbolic instruction, or discipline. By means of this, certain symbols can be recognized as facts. The person concerned is instructed in the occult laws of nature, through which quite definite effects are produced through cyclic movements in humanity. The second kind of instruction or discipline is the so-called philosophic one. It is the Egyptian Hermetic discipline. It consists of a more theoretical kind of instruction. The third kind of instruction is the so-called mystical discipline, which is based more upon inner development, and which, if rightly applied, would lead, above all else, to the appropriate manipulation of the philosopher's stone, that is, to the overcoming of death. That is essentially expressed in one of the sentences which I read out to you, which stated that by means of Freemasonry, everyone is able to convince himself of the fact of immortality. It depends, however, as the Kabbalah says, whether this is requested or not. The 4th kind of instruction is the Kabbalistic one. It consists in the recognition of the principles of world harmony in their truth and reality. The 10 basic, readers aside, there's a gap in the text, end of readers aside. By means of each of the 4 paths, one can rise to a higher perception through the Mizraim rite. But there is actually no one within the ranks of Freemasonry today who would accept the responsibility of giving practical guidance to anyone. because those concerned have not undergone these things themselves. And the whole affair is a provisional arrangement, and only intended to provide a framework for something which is still to come. It is possible that this framework will be filled with occult knowledge. Occult knowledge has to be cast in existing molds. The important thing is that such molds exist in the world. If there is molten metal and no mold into which to pour it, you are unable to do anything but let it run out in one lump. So it is also with spiritual currents. It is important that molds exist into which can be poured the spiritual metal that is symbolized by the molten sea. That will become recognized when what is now seemingly only vegetating receives form for outward manifestation. Last time I read to you from a speech by the English Prime Minister Balfour. From that, then, it is already noticeable that certain things are physical truths today that are in primeval occult perceptions. If you read Blavatsky's title, The Secret Doctrine, you will find there a passage relating to electricity, which expresses, word for word, what physicists are now gradually arriving at. What is written there is, however, only a hint at what is actually involved. It is the physical atom that is in question. This was misunderstood by all outward but not occult science until 4 or 5 years ago. It was taken to be a body having mass in space. Nowadays one is beginning to recognize that this physical atom bears the same relationship to the force of electricity that a lump of ice bears to the water from which it has been frozen. If you conceive of water becoming frozen to ice, so is the ice also water, and in like manner the atom of physics is nothing else but frozen electricity. If you can grasp this point completely, and were to go through the statements about the atom contained in all the scientific journals until a year or two ago, and were to regard them as rubbish, you will have more or less the right idea. It is only very recently that science has been able to form a conception of what the atom is. It stands in the same relationship to electricity as ice does to the water out of which it has been frozen. The physical atom is condensed electricity. I regard Balfour's speech as something of extreme importance. It is, readers aside, there's a gap in the text, end of readers aside, something which has been published since 1875, in brackets 1879 possibly, question mark. The fact has been known to occultists for millennia. Now, one is beginning to realize that the physical atom is condensed electricity. But there is still a second thing to be considered, what electricity itself is. That is still unknown. They are ignorant of one thing, namely where the real nature of electricity must be sought. This nature of electricity cannot be discovered by means of any outer experiments or through outer observation. The secret which will be discovered is that electricity, when one learns to view it from a particular level, is exactly the same as what human thought is. Human thought is the same thing as electricity, viewed one time from the inside, another time from the outside. Whoever is now aware of what electricity is knows that there is something living within him which in a frozen state forms the atom. Here is the bridge from human thought to the atom. One will learn to know the building stones of the physical world. They are tiny condensed monads, condensed electricity. In that moment when human beings realize this elementary occult truth about thought, electricity, and the atom, in that same moment they will have understood something that is of the utmost importance for the future and for the whole of the sixth post-Atlantean epoch. They will have learned how to build with atoms through the power of thinking. This will be the spiritual current which will again have to be cast in the molds that have been prepared for it by occultists over millennia. But because the human race had to pass through the era of the development of understanding, and to look away from the true inner work, the molds have become mere shells. But they still retain their function as molds, and the right kind of knowledge will have to be poured into them. The occult investigator obtains his truth from the one side, the physical scientist from the other. Just as Freemasonry has developed out of working masonry, out of the building of cathedrals and temples, so one will in future learn to build with the smallest of building blocks, with entities of condensed electricity. That will call for a new kind of masonry. Then industry will not be able to carry on any more as it does today. It will become so chaotic, and will only be able to work purely out of the struggle for existence per se, as long as man does not know. Readers aside, there's a gap in the text, end of readers aside, footnote. There is a gap here in the shorthand report. However, a completion of the sentence is to be found in legible writing, bracket, what has to be poured into these husks in the way of thought, end of footnote. Then it would be possible for someone in Berlin to drive into the city in a cab, while in Moscow a disaster which he had caused was taking place, and nobody at all would have any inkling that he had been the cause of it. Wireless telegraphy is the beginning of this. What I have portrayed is in the future. There are only two possibilities available. Either things go on chaotically, as industry and technology have done until now, in which case it will lead to whoever has the possession of these things being able to cause havoc, or else it will be cast in the moral mold of Freemasonry. Footnote. This last sentence appears as follows in the notes of Marie Steiner von Sievers. Quote, these things will either continue chaotically, as industry and technology have done until now, or harmoniously, as is the aim of Freemasonry. Then the highest development will be achieved. End of footnote. There's a question. Why is the Catholic Church so antagonistic toward Freemasonry? Answer from Steiner. The Catholic Church does not want what is coming in the future. Pius IX was initiated into Freemasonry. He tried, through the chapter of Clermont, to bring about a connection between the Jesuits and the Freemasons. That did not succeed, and therefore the old enmity between these two remained. Our Jesuits know little about these things, and the clergy are also unaware of what is involved. The actual clergy, readers aside, there's actually a large gap in the text here, and readers aside. The Trappists have to keep silent, for it is known that by doing so an important faculty of inspired speech in the next life is implanted. That is indeed only to be understood through a knowledge of reincarnation. I have asked you to attend a short discussion on occult questions, because one must acknowledge that anyone participating in the theosophical movement should be clear not only about the outward things that are dealt with in the program, but also about the direction in which this theosophical movement can lead. Now, those occult streams that are living in the theosophical movement are in fact akin, in a particular respect, to earlier occult currents. The topic we mean to broach today concerns precisely one of these, which still persists to the present day, Freemasonry. You know that at least until the late 17th century, any kind of female member was, for Freemasonry, strictly taboo. At that time there was a good reason for this. When the reason for the Freemasons, having no female members, ceases to exist at some point in world evolution, then the time will have come for the work of Freemasonry on the physical plane to be taken over by the work of Theosophy. Pro tem, the work of Theosophy is preparatory work. Men and women will participate in the theosophical work on the same basis. If I were now to be permitted to say briefly why women had to be excluded from the activities of Freemasonry, I could only say that one does not exactly give away one's secrets to the opponent. One hardly sends him one's plan of campaign. That is not done in the conduct of any war. And we will see that Freemasonry is in a particular respect in opposition to the female world. Freemasonry is the continuation of very ancient secret societies and brotherhoods. Such secret societies, at least in the form in which they survive in Freemasonry, originated just at the very beginning of our fourth post-Atlantean epoch, that is to say, in the same epoch in which Christianity later began. You know that the outward compilation of the Bible is rightly ascribed to only a few hundred years before the birth of Christ. But the biblical revelation was a living tradition for thousands of years before that. It was not the custom in antiquity to write such things down. They were instead passed on from mouth to mouth. Therefore, it can be assumed that the secrets which Moses entrusted to the priesthood were only later written down. Now, in the same period as that when the Bible first made its appearance in world history as a document, what is known as the Freemasonry legend also came to be compiled and to be circulated. In world evolution, it is always to be regarded as a law that what happened earlier is later briefly recapitulated. Every human being recapitulates in the maternal womb the stages through which the human race has already passed. Every planetary stage of the Earth repeats in its initial stages the previously completed steps of its evolution. What has already gone before is always briefly recapitulated. So is it with the races too. Hence, the first, second, and third post-Atlantean races, epochs, are the recapitulation of earlier earthly conditions, only in a specific higher realm. What began with Lemuria developed throughout Atlantis and was recapitulated in our three cultural epochs in a specific higher realm, so that we thus have a recapitulation of what occurred earlier in Lemurian times in a less developed realm. Before the system of two sexes originated, there was a kind of bisexuality, a single combined sex, insofar as in each individual both sexes were represented. For the separation into two sexes only came later. Only then did male-female become male and female. On a spiritual level, something similar is recapitulated in our epoch. Actually, that kind of knowledge and wisdom which pertained in pre-Vedic ancient India had a male-female quality, and thereby at the same time something quite unconnected with any kind of duality or with any kind of outward principle. Then came the civilization of the second cultural epoch. This was preeminently a spiritual culture having two sexes. Dualism then appeared, Ormuzd and Ahriman, good and evil. All this now merged with man's cognition. Now we want to clarify how that came about. It came about thus. In the beginning, before there was a separate male and female sex, there was a twofold sexuality within each single individual. We must now ask, what was it that could become fertilized, and what was it that did the fertilizing in the one single individual? In ancient Greek mythology, Zeus is portrayed with ample female breasts. A truth is expressed therein which was known in the old mysteries and which we also learn from the records, that the sex, if I may call it that immediately preceded our own outwardly and physically, resembled not the male but the female gender. So that before the outward separation, we have thus both sexes in one individual that outwardly, in physical expression and in all perceptions and being, was female. Therefore, at the beginning of the human race, we have to do with a bisexual individual tending toward the female. Only later did the male sex follow. Now we must be clear that in this individual, which had both sexes in it, a fertilizing agent, or male seed, was also present. Woman contained man within her. When we have grasped the fact that the woman had the male principle within her, then we can conceive, with our ordinary scientific concepts, that reproduction was ensured. We want to bear in mind that at that time this happened via the woman. Now came the time when things had to go their separate ways. What character did the fertilizing principle in the woman then have, which on the physical plane would fertilize the female nature? What worked in the female body as a seed was the male, and that was what was spiritual, the wisdom. Woman contributed the substance. The spirit gave it form. Any structuring on the physical plane is a realization of wisdom. Wisdom worked in the female. Now the two differentiated themselves, in that the two things which had previously worked as one now appeared as two separate poles. What was previously united in a single human organ became separated, whereby a duality in human development originated. This duality came about thus. First, the fertility, the ability of the female egg to fertilize itself, within the one individual ceased to function. The female egg lost the possibility of becoming fertilized from its own body. So we are now dealing with a female which has become infertile, and above everything, the spiritual. The division of the two sexes came about through the separation of the physical organs, and the other sex was now endowed with the possibility of fertilization. Two individuals appeared, one with physical femininity and the other with physical masculinity. With the man, wisdom has a female character. With the woman, it has a male character. The separation is a very definite event that one can follow. We will now have to be satisfied, however, with mere indications. We are dealing then with male-tinged wisdom in the woman and female-tinged wisdom in the man. This female-tinged wisdom is passive, suited to receiving, listening, watching, to taking in from the surroundings. The male-tinged wisdom, the active wisdom, is productive. Thus we have a twofold wisdom. There is the female wisdom that is active, and that naturally will also be transferred to the men. Thus there may indeed be plenty of men to take over the female wisdom. The race is propagated below on the physical plane, and above we are dealing with an active intuition stemming from women, and with a passive cognition decidedly male in character. This figures in the old mystery teachings as the antithesis between the sons of Abel, or sons of God, and the sons of Cain, or sons of man. Abel represents the female, active intuition. Therefore he is unable to take hold of anything from the outside world which needs to be worked upon. He takes up the divine, which streams through him, which flows into his intuitiveness. The, in quotes, herdsman symbolizes that. He tends and nurtures life, while intuition nurtures the divine life of wisdom. Cain has the male wisdom that receives the outward. This wisdom espouses the earth in order to till it. The material is outside himself. He is the field builder, bracket, literal meaning of German der Ackerbauer, agriculturalist, close bracket. What does the wisdom of Cain now achieve? This science of Cain, that being a passive science only receives, what does it accomplish? Now there is a very interesting and important legend in which these truths are symbolically expressed for the Freemasons. That is the temple legend. And the reason for it is as follows. The Bible itself, the Old Testament, derives from the female, the intuitive wisdom, and bears its stamp. The Old Testament is female wisdom. Male wisdom was not able to attain to intuition. It confined itself to building and work. It took stones and constructed buildings. It took metals and made implements. The temple legend puts it thus. One of the Elohim impregnated Eve, and Cain was born. Afterward another of the Elohim, Jehovah, also known as Adonai, created Adam. And Adam begat Abel by Eve. This legend counterposed the wisdom of Cain and the biblical wisdom, so that by the beginning of the fourth post-Atlantean epoch we have two opposing currents, the Bible representing womanly wisdom, and the temple wisdom as its opposing male counterpart. Already in pre-Christian times, what the man, brackets male wisdom question mark, wanted stood in opposition to the female wisdom. Moreover, Cain slew his brother Abel. That too comes into the temple legend. Jehovah caused strife between the race of Cain and the race of Abel, and Cain killed Abel. That means nothing else. Readers aside, some very obscure sentences follow here in the German transcript that are not written down. End of readers aside. What was the consequence of the appearance of this Cain wisdom? The outcome of it all was that the fruitfulness that was propagated through its own wisdom was killed. By killing Abel, the male knowledge in Cain killed the possibility of self-propagation that had been brought into being by the gods. That means it is because knowledge had been transferred to the man that the Abel in man has been killed. That is a process in man himself. Through male knowledge, the creative force, the Abel within, has been killed. There now stand in hostile opposition to one another the descendants of Cain and the race of those who were put in the place of Abel, the descendants of Seth. The descendants of Cain are those who use their masculine wisdom to build up the external world. The passive wisdom is applied to external construction. The divine wisdom does not stream down into it. It must build in the world out of what is free. It has no divine intuition. Through trial, through experience, results the harmonizing of the purely mineral products of the earth. Thus Tubal-Cain is born out of the race of Cain, and thus later on will Hiram-Abith, or Adon-Hiram, be born from the same lineage. I have reserved for myself, readers aside, it says here, see note, end of readers aside. Among the Abelites, you find the strongest representative in Solomon. During the third cultural epoch, all the representatives of the Abel line were priests. The ancient priestly wisdom was the intuitive wisdom that formerly worked in woman as the power of fertilization, but was then transformed at a higher level to spiritual wisdom. Out of this priestly wisdom came the Bible. In this way, the Bible came to be a feminine wisdom. This feminine wisdom is able to make great revelations about the divine and to say how this relates to the angels and spirits. The business of the sons of Cain is to shape the earth. Thus the original father of all smiths is indeed Tubal-Cain. Therefore Solomon had to send for Hiram-Abith, who could build the temple for him. He built it for King Solomon, the inheritor of the ancient priestly wisdom. For him, for Solomon, who transformed this priestly wisdom into external power. Kingship as an outward institution derives from the rule of the priests. Thus Solomon sent for Hiram-Abith, and thus Solomon's temple was built. But now the Queen of Sheba came to Solomon's court, and a kind of betrothal was celebrated there between the two. Now the temple was shown to the queen, and she desired to be introduced to the builder of this marvelous temple. When she was introduced to Hiram-Abith, something quite special happened in her. A glance from Hiram-Abith fell on her, and that worked in her like fire. And then a second thing happened as follows. She wanted to see the workers and to be shown how all this was accomplished on the physical plane. So Hiram-Abith took the Tau symbol, held it aloft, and the workers all came streaming together like ants. Through this she was so impressed that she deserted Solomon for Hiram. Some of Hiram's apprentices, whom he had refused to make into masters, came to Solomon's aid. Now they sought to spoil Hiram's masterpiece, the casting of the molten sea. Instead of it coming out as a work of art, streams of fire spurted out in every direction. Hiram-Abith tried to quench it all with water, but all he achieved by this was a complete wreck. A rain of fire sprayed down on everything, including Hiram Abiff. A voice called to him, however, not to be afraid, for out of this would come his greatest success. Then he was led by a figure to the center of the earth. There he met Cain himself, to whom he had been led by Tubal-Cain, who founded the art of metalworking. Here an important wisdom was revealed to him. He was told, quote, "Now know the true Jehovah, who is the cause of your being here. Jehovah hates the sons of fire and wants to destroy them. He wants to destroy his own creation. But you need have nothing to fear. To you will be born a son who you will not yourself see, but from whom shall spring a race out of which a new fire worship will develop on the earth." Close quote. With the hammer which Tubal-Cain gave him, he was able to complete the projected molten sea, thereby rising still further in the Queen of Sheba's affections. During a walk, a bird appeared in the air, showing her the mystical Tau sign. From this, the queen's nurse realized that the wisdom of the future was hidden under this sign of the Tau. During a feast at which Solomon became intoxicated, the Queen of Sheba took the betrothal ring back from his hand. Hiram Abiff was, however, set upon by the apprentices and killed. He was only just able to write the secret word on a golden triangle and hide it. It was later retrieved and enclosed in a stone shaped in the form of a cube. The 10 Commandments are inscribed on this stone that conceals the hidden word. That is the temple wisdom, which male science has counterposed to the female wisdom. These are things that need only to be clarified, to be examined as to their occult meaning, for their deep significance to be recognized. Consider that Hiram Abiff was brought before the original father of his race. He was told that Jehovah was the enemy of the sons of fire. Who are the sons of fire? They are those who could only come into existence after the separation of the sexes, through the penetration of a physical female by a physical male. Fire is the active principle in the male semen. In male semen lives fire in the occult sense. Jehovah had to create this basic force so that the race could propagate itself. Jehovah created the sons of fire, which was only possible on the basis of this occult fire. Hence he is the opponent of change. He it was who continued the old kind of propagation. For it was an expedient which had been created, and therefore he turned again to the priests and made them into his prophets. He caused the power and the glory of his own wisdom to be proclaimed through the priestly wisdom. Through the priestly wisdom, Jehovah's wisdom came to be made known. Hiram Abiff is thus appointed to undertake the creation of the molten sea, which means the transformation of the mineral kingdom through art. He was also told that a son would be born to him who, even though he would not himself be able to see him, would bring forth a new race. This son is nothing else than the new race which will one day take the place of the old, the present one. The new race for whom it will no longer be necessary for 2 sexes to unite with one another, but will again be able to bring about propagation through the one human individual. This refers to a far distant future. The old female culture will be relieved by a male culture. The female as a physical form will die out. The male must then have the power in itself to produce another individual out of itself. And where is this power located? Male and female used to be in one individual. And when these two separated, an unfolding of today's individuality took place. The upper part of the human being was formed. What today is the upper part was at that time combined with the sexual organs. The sexual organs of today are only half of the then procreative force. The power in the larynx is indeed the other half. Speech is not as yet creative today. It has to be penetrated by the wisdom of Cain first, and then it must produce. When man has attained the power for his larynx so to develop that his word will be creative, so that he will produce his own kind through the word, then the whole of the productive force will be transferred to the male. Then the work of creation, which was once done by the gods, will be given over to man. When did the word come to be lost? When the system of two sexes originated, it was buried, hidden. The sons of Cain had it only through the original father of their race. Hiram Abiff should at least have the prophecy about it. However, he was killed immediately afterward. The word lies buried, but it is still there. If it were not buried, man would be self-creative, just as the Elohim are self-creative. Therefore, the, in quotes, word of present-day Freemasonry is not the true word, but the false one. The true word is concealed. The 10 Commandments are inscribed on the stone which contains the hidden word. What are the 10 Commandments? They are the laws of the moral world order. They maintain the outer intercourse of man as it now is, subject to the influence of a race having two sexes. Such laws will not be needed when there are no longer two sexes. They are that human code which originated out of the context of two sexes. Thus we have, preserved in Freemasonry, the remembrance of the lost word, which those who work in Freemasonry must strive for, and which can only be gained when the passive male wisdom awakens activity in itself. The Freemasons therefore say, everything which does not stem from one's personal knowledge about the world must be a remnant of the female priestly rule of ancient times. Rather than contenting ourselves with merely inheriting this, conquering it, in question mark in brackets, we actually want to start on a new spiral of existence. We ourselves must bring intuition to the male wisdom of Cain. That would be impossible if one took the female into the secret, which would take man's power from him. It would all be useless the instant it was discussed in front of women. It thus became necessary for the whole female sex to be excluded from Freemasonry. This hangs together with the link between the organ of speech and gender or sexuality. Therefore, the man's voice changes when he reaches puberty. The change of voice is nothing else than the expression of the former connection between the organs of speech and of sexuality. Now you too can grasp what the Freemason is saying. It is only the man who is appointed to enter the lost word at all and to re-establish it. Only the male form of the larynx is in a position to say, to know, what can be regained through the lost word. When we grasp it in this way, one will understand why woman was not permitted to let what was new pass her lips. It is comic to see scholars give as the reason for this that women were not admitted because they blabbered out everything. The female larynx has remained as a rudiment. It is the male larynx which will, however, form the organ of the future. You see, the deep and meaningful relationships are involved, and that the expression Mason has to be taken as literally as possible. That is why the Masons of Greek and Roman times were the builders of things made to express beauty. Cathedrals, temples, and other significant buildings were built by these master builders. The matter rests thus, that a part of what came to be accomplished by the order of Freemasons had naturally to be taken over again from the old priestly wisdom. So once again we have an intermingling of womanly wisdom and male striving. In essence, the secret of Freemasonry is something which has not yet been revealed, which is not even there yet, so that it cannot be revealed, precisely because it does not yet exist. It is something which will be uttered when the word is once more imbued with productive force. Those are a few words which will clarify the thinking of Freemasonry for the occultist. Up to the 18th century it was known that things were so. Only when the connection with higher worlds was lost did the consciousness of what was lost fade from Freemasonry too. And yet again, not so. Freemasonry was watered down. It was said that people no longer knew its meaning. One must be clear, however, that everything which existed as symbols was derived from the old priestly wisdom, and that what is implanted therein in the symbols must still first come into the open. The true female wisdom is gradually becoming quite lost. Because of that, the so-called higher degrees of Freemasonry, which preserved the female wisdom, have been allowed to vanish. All that is still left is what is called craft masonry, which only concerns itself with worldly things, and only understands a little about them in any case. But that is, after all, quite natural. As materialism developed, then the priestly wisdom did indeed have to fade away. What can happen now? The old wisdom has gone away. We have to live in the externalities. What follows from that? This, that something better can come along again only when a wisdom arrives which is again asexual, which is connected neither with the male nor with the female wisdom, neither with the female Bible nor with the male temple legend. We find this wisdom in theosophy. In this wisdom both sexes understand each other. In it the man that is in woman is at work on woman, and what is once more asexual is working on man. Male and female meet each other there in the knowledge of higher planes. It is therefore quite natural that the proper occult basis has come about in Freemasonry, and that a new start has been made. Something such as this is called a vortex, and there's a picture. In our time, these things are thus intertwining in their influence. We must therefore think of them as interacting. Thus, theosophy has relied neither on the biblical legend nor on the temple legend, but asexually seeks the kernel of wisdom that has to be restored again in everything. Now you see how theosophy is the bringer of peace, the harmonizer. How does this work together in our root race? Our root race recapitulates what already was there before. It brings the antithesis of what was already there in Lemurian times to meaningful expression in the spiritual realm. An opposition had therefore to come about, because the female sex was there originally and follows a falling curve, whereas the male sex is in a rising curve and is seeking in itself the procreative force which the female already has. When we remain in lower spheres, we have to make an exact distinction through occultism. Whoever is racially an Atlantean man need not also be Atlantean in his soul qualities. Hence the soul is not tied to a particular sex either. The souls of female gender work through this until they can live equally with men in the bodies the latter have made for themselves, and there will then be one sex on earth. As long as men still stood in opposition to the female, they had to hold their tongues. The founding of the adoption lodges in the 18th century paved the way for the sexes to come together. The first of these was founded in 1775. A Freemasonry was practiced in them that had different symbols from the male Freemasonry. However, the induction of women in such adoption lodges of the male Freemasons did pave the way for the sexes to come together. The founder of our society was indeed a female member of such an adoption lodge. What must be pointed to as the beginning of theosophy did indeed thus play a part in the matter. So, theosophy is a world task, connected with occult currents, and must take over where Freemasonry left off. Freemasonry could indeed still be reawakened and could help us. But the more profound thought is this: these one-sided male endeavors must be vanquished in theosophical circles. Throughout the Middle Ages there was a sublime preparation for spiritually engendering the opposite sex in man. Man developed in himself by concentrating, at first as a thought, what had to become a reality in him later on. Therefore, as a preparation for this, the cult of Mary resulted during the Middle Ages. This is nothing else than concentrating to engender the female in the male, while for the female, the cult of Jesus served the parallel purpose. The cult of Mary had its origin in this foundation. You will now see what confusion must result when an order arose which broke with all this and sought to regain the female wisdom. It is world dominion which is at stake in this. If anyone wants to leave the old wisdom as it is, he will have to conquer the world for the old powers. There is such an order. It is the Jesuit order. It has consciously set itself this task. That is why the Jesuits and the Freemasons confront each other so sourly. The things which we wish to discuss today have not hitherto been discussed in front of women. Therefore, it is a rather bold step I am taking to speak about these things to you. However, particular occult currents make it necessary. Within these currents there are some things of an intimate nature, which up to a short while ago could not be mentioned in the presence of women, because the occult brotherhood, whose task it was to nurture these intimate things, had a strict rule to admit no women members. What they had to do in the world might not be done in cooperation with the female element. Until just recently, this rule has been strictly adhered to. Nowadays, the sole possibility of creating a balance between the two sexes exists only in the Theosophical Society. Here is indeed the only place where these things are discussed in front of women. Now we ask, why has this separation of the sexes come about, which has taken such a grotesque form in the lodges of Freemasonry? If one wants to understand why this segregation really became habitual, one has to use a rather grotesque metaphor. When two powers are at war with each other, it would be very foolish if the general of one side were to reveal his plan of campaign to the enemy general before the battle started. It would be the same as handing over one's weapons to the enemy, if one were to enlist women in the Freemasons. For it is a matter of war for the Freemasons, a war indeed against the female spirit, a matter of sharp opposition to the female spirit as such. This war was necessary. Yes, occult Freemasonry was founded precisely for this purpose. Therefore, it was the custom to speak about occult matters to the two sexes separately. First, a form must be found in which these things can be spoken of to women. The founding of Freemasonry lies far back in the past. It took place at the beginning of the fourth cultural epoch of our present fifth post-Atlantean root race. The Old Testament, which gives us an explanation of these things, was written down at that same time. We are told that higher spirits made revelations to Moses, which he then wrote down. The knowledge of higher things was already there, however, much earlier, and was handed on from generation to generation, from priestly mouth to priestly mouth, until it was put into documentary form by Ezra, to whom the writing of these things is ascribed. When the Old Testament began to gain power through the priests, a tremendous opposition to this priestly book arose in the Freemasonry brotherhoods, for a particular reason. To be sure, this opposition has always been there, and it was necessary. We must be clear about why. Let us agree that everything which happens on the physical plane has to recapitulate earlier stages in a particular way. On earth, there is always a recapitulation of the events of earlier times. In his life before birth, man has to go through the stages which he once experienced with his dull animal consciousness in earlier times. So, for instance, the Renaissance period of the Middle Ages was a recapitulation of ancient Greek times. We also find such recapitulation in planetary events. Before the present Earth became what it is today, it had to recapitulate earlier conditions before it could become an independent planet, our Earth, in fact, in the fourth round, or recapitulation. Thus, whenever anything new has to appear on Earth, the earlier stages must always be recapitulated in a new form. So the human spirit in the fifth root race our present race, has worked through a recapitulation of the happenings of the Lemurian root race, the third race, when humanity was still of one sex only, and then became two-sexed. That had a great influence on its spiritual development. In the third subrace of the fifth root race, the Egypto-Babylonian period, there was a progressive recapitulation in the realm of spiritual life of what had happened physically to man of Lemurian times. Before there was separate male and female, the two were combined. Then the two sexes separated from each other. As regards spiritual development, we have this happening in the fifth root race. Third root race, Lemuria, division of physical evolution into two sexes, male and female. Fifth root race, division of spiritual evolution into male and female spirit, into Jehovah worship or priesthood, and Freemasonry. In the first post-Atlantean epoch, in the ancient Indian culture, everything was still at a higher level than the physical plane. The original Indian wisdom, which stems from the first post-Atlantean civilization, is, spiritually speaking, primarily connected not with the present physical plane, but with the conditions of that earlier time when humanity was still combined male-female. Therefore, at that time, little regard was paid to the existence of separate sexes. There was no question of a dualistic principle in this. That comes only in the following subrace. The Vedas belong to a much later time. Already in the second subrace, there was a great schism. The outward expression of this schism is depicted for us in the Old Testament quite wonderfully. Genesis has expressed it very beautifully and clearly. Before Yahweh created man, he made fruits and animals and so on earth. And only then did he create man, Adam, whom he then divided into two sexes. This account rests on occult perceptions of the physical facts. Now, of course, all occult wisdom presents a relationship between physical events and later spiritual wisdom. For physical events arise out of divine wisdom, and wisdom later re-emerges out of physical life, out of man. There is a connection there between wisdom, perception, and physical life. The whole fertilizing and fructifying force by which a new person is created used to be combined in one sex. Then the human being was separated into male and female. Which sex can best lay claim to the generative power? It is the female. Therefore Zeus, who was worshipped as the progenitor of the human race, was portrayed in the oldest versions of Greek mythology as having female breasts. Zeus, as a superhuman being, was nearer to the female sex. The female sex was thus the first, the earlier one, and at that time had the power in itself of producing the complete human individual. This generative power lay within a human being of undivided sex, who approximated in its outward physical form more toward the female. In this single-sexed human being, the fertilizing principle was wisdom, the spirit itself. And the fertilizing of the female spirit by inspired wisdom is a later recapitulation of this. This human being of the single-sex era was the result of the fertilization by the divine spirit of the substance produced in the woman. Now you can understand what it was by which a woman could give birth to a human being. Physically, there is, first of all, a woman who is fertilized from above. It was the divine spirit in woman which was the fertilizing principle. When the separation of the sexes happened, the differentiation started in the transformation of the female's spiritual organs of fertilization into organs of wisdom. The masculine power that the woman had in herself turned the creative force into organs of wisdom. So, half the generative force stayed with the woman. The creative, physical forces stayed with the man. As a result of this separation, the spinal cord and the brain with the nerve branches appeared, as portrayed in the tree of life and the tree of knowledge. The organ of wisdom is formed in the vertebra by the spinal cord and its extension into the brain. From that time on, there is a duality in man, namely the two trees of the biblical record, the tree of knowledge and the tree of life. And now the new beings adapt themselves to the change. The individuals who had previously been female did not all subsequently take on the female form. The female side, the capacity to produce human beings, withdrew from one section and left behind in substitution the power to fertilize in a quite different way. Physical nature had separated into what fertilized and what needed to be fertilized. Spiritual nature, too, had been similarly divided. In female individuals, the spirit acquired male character and coloring. In the male, the spirit had a female character. That is still the female within man. The biblical legend shows this very clearly. As is known, the man having two sexes was forbidden to eat from the tree of knowledge. The power with which Jehovah had invested mankind was to make his wisdom become active in the woman. Quote, "Thou shalt not eat of the tree of knowledge," close quote, means the same as, quote, "Thou shalt not separate off the force of fertilization and make it independent," close quote. For Jehovah's power, the fertilizing power, would thereby be lost to the woman. When woman ate from the tree of knowledge, she thereby laid the basis for becoming independent in respect of wisdom, thereby ceasing to remain a mere tool of Jehovah as he had planned. But thus she lost, along with Jehovah's power, the power to fertilize herself through wisdom as well. By eating from the tree of knowledge and giving the apple to man, she wiped this power out. This woman became dependent on man. It was Lucifer who led mankind along this path in order to make him independent. Jehovah was against this, and forbade man to eat from the tree of knowledge for that reason. However, the woman did eat, and gave it to the man. The man ate too, so that the punishment decreed by Jehovah ensued. New bodies have to come into existence, which will work out the karma of previous existence. Death and rebirth come into the world. Woman is now no longer fertile through herself, but has become barren. And with fertilization coming from outside, the possibility of this kind of death enters the world. The biblical story of paradise reveals this deep connection in images. Ancient priestly traditions became the content in these images, and ancient priestly wisdom was vividly incorporated in them. Woman has, then, become infertile in respect of spiritual wisdom because she has demanded physical perception. She gave to man, and he ate as well. They were guilty and were driven out of paradise, to the formation of which they had made no contribution. That is the old priestly tradition about the origin of the sexes. This contains a profound insight into the connection between actual events. What now happened as the result of the female separating herself from the male? Which of the sexes still possessed a shadow of that power of productive spiritual wisdom, the male or the female? We have seen that the wisdom of the female actually had a male character. This is the creative, the productive, the intuitive, what is original, what is fertile. The same divine power which formerly worked within woman to fertilize, to produce the physical human being, now worked as fertilizing principle in the perception of the divine center in man's being. The religions work through words and images to further this process. The female being becomes physically infertile, in the sense that she cannot produce offspring out of herself as she did before. The masculine, passive spirit is the one which is spiritually infertile. But the man is the one who can fertilize physically. Spiritually, he now lets himself be fertilized by everything in the world. He now becomes spiritually fertilized so that he himself can fertilize physically. The whole world penetrates him first. He becomes fertilized spiritually, the woman physically. Woman, by contrast, is spiritually self-fertilizing, whereas man is fertilized by the spirit. The male wisdom is fertilized by everything external being gathered and combined. Male wisdom thus resulted, which was oriented toward assembling worldly wisdom. This kind of wisdom was not actually there at first, as against that which flowed down from above. It had first to be put together by perceiving the physical world. Female wisdom, by contrast, was actually transferred to the priesthood. The wisdom of the priests became the substance derived originally from the ancient feminine wisdom. Indeed, only if he separated it into two sexes could Jehovah preserve the human race. Two opposing factions resulted: Freemasonry and priestly rule, which were symbolized by Cain and Abel. Now, there is a difference between the female priestly wisdom and the male aspiration. This is described to us in the legend of Cain and Abel. Abel was a shepherd and occupied himself with a life that was already there. He is the symbol of the inborn, divine force which works in man as the wisdom which he does not acquire for himself, which flows into him. Cain creates something new out of what the world offers. He represents the passive masculine wisdom, which must at first be fertilized from outside, which goes out into the world to gather wisdom and to create from what has been gathered. Cain killed Abel, which means that male wisdom offers resistance against the female wisdom, since it feels that it must subdue and remodel physical wisdom. The old Freemasons set themselves the ideal, therefore, of taking up this challenge. They wanted to use male wisdom to work against the female wisdom that had been taken over by the priesthood. The great images of the Bible were to be considered as intuitive female wisdom transferred to the priests, to which they wished to counterpose the wisdom self-acquired by the male. This battle against the wisdom of the priests expressed the opposition of the Freemasons. Those who took part in it had to be kept free of every influence of the female wisdom. This battle was concerned with physical evolution, and it was therefore necessary for the Freemasons to avoid any contact with the female sex as far as their work was concerned. They knew that their opposition to the female spirit could only be carried through if they were undisturbed by female thinking. One had to affirm something positive and generally prevent any disturbing element interfering. Freemasonry thus created the temple legend as an answer to the Bible legend. This was to be the sword of battle against the priesthood. We therefore want to bring this temple legend before your soul. It has the following content. In the beginning, one of the Elohim created Cain by uniting himself with Eve. Another Elohim, Yahweh, countered by creating Adam, who united with Eve, as a result of which Abel was born. Cain killed Abel, and Jehovah therefore made the race of Cain subject to the race of Abel. That means that originally the worldly wisdom rebelled against the priestly wisdom and was defeated, for the Abel line was continued in Seth, and all worldly wisdom was made subservient to the priestly wisdom. Next, it is related how the descendants of Cain conquered the world, how they developed the arts, music, arts, and sciences were cultivated by them. Tubal-Cain, Genesis 4:21-22, the master of brass and ironwork. Jubal, from whom the pipers and violinists are descended, and Hiram, the builder of Solomon's temple, 1 Kings 7:13, are numbered among the descendants of Cain. So, with Hiram, we have arrived at the transition from the third to the fourth post-Atlantean epoch, when priestly rule turned into rule by kings. Kingship results from God's grace, as represented by King Solomon. Solomon's power was not sustained by work done on the physical plane, but was the manifestation of God's grace. Priestly wisdom was turned into rule by kings. This was thus regarded as the successor to priestly rule, which was now unable to do from its own resources what was necessary for the progress of mankind on earth. The one who was to build the temple had to be enlisted from among the descendants of Cain, because he would possess the autonomously worked out thinking. The legend goes on to relate that Balkis, the queen of Sheba, was betrothed to King Solomon. She visited him and was astounded at the temple building, as he was at her wisdom. She wanted to see the master builder himself, for she could not conceive how such a wonderful building could result from human wisdom. Hiram came and made a forceful impression on her, simply by his glance alone. Next, she asked to see those who worked on the temple as well. When Solomon said this was impossible, Hiram made the mystical Tau sign in the air, and all the workers streamed together immediately. In the mystical Tau sign lie the forces where the sons of Cain used to work on the physical plane. 3 of Hiram's apprentices are discontented because he did not promote them to the master's degree. They conspire to hurt him. They want to spoil his masterpiece. Now he intends to make the molten sea. This is a major work of art, to be cast out of a fluid element, out of a molten brass. This is a symbol of the great work of art, for which the entire mineral kingdom must be recast, which is the task of the Manvantara. The 3 apprentices do the following. They wreck the casting of the molten sea. Hiram tries to put this right by pouring water on the casting. Everything then flies apart in a shower of fiery rain. As Hiram, in despair, gives himself up for lost, he is led to the center of the earth by a figure whom he recognizes as Tubal-Cain. There, he is told that Jehovah, or Adonai, is nothing else than an enemy of the sons of fire. He wants to destroy the sons of fire. Hiram, however, would have a son whom he would indeed never see, but who would found a new race on earth. Tubal-Cain then gave him a hammer with which he can complete the casting of the molten sea. However, the 3 apprentices murder him. Before his death he breathes out a word, which he inscribes on a golden triangle and buries. No one understands the word. It is the lost word of the Freemasons. Hiram is buried, and an acacia twig is planted on his grave. The triangle is dug up again, but no one knows its worth. It is buried again, and a cube set up, on which the 10 Commandments are inscribed. Now, what is meant by, quote, Jehovah hates the sons of fire, close quote? These are the people who were born by means of the single sex, Cain. In them, wisdom is mingled with Kama, the earthly kamic fire, that is the astral body. Those who have devoted themselves to the female priesthood are the sons of Abel. Hiram was promised, quote, you will have a son who will found a new race. However, you will not know him. Close quote. This new race must come when the lost word regains its power and is installed in a new way. The occult tradition, which is embodied in Freemasonry, works to bring about the reestablishment of the lost word. It works to enable the introduction of the active into the passive male element, so that it can regain the creative force in the spirit to turn what is passive into something active, so that the sons of Cain can produce out of themselves. The following tradition developed. The female was the primeval force. This gave the world everything that was in the world as wisdom. However, the female element lost part of the physical power of reproduction, which was transferred to the male. Now everything becomes spiritualized again, in which process the male power attempts to grab control for itself. The male element in thinking seeks to outlast the female. There will come a time, however, when sexlessness will again be reestablished, and the struggle is about which of the two sexes will first attain this state of sexlessness. Hence, Freemasonry endeavors to make the male sex, or, to express it better, the male spirit, outlast the female and attain to the state of sexlessness. Now, there is an occult connection between the power of speech and the power of sexual production. The Word has made everything. Originally, it lived in man. Then man lost it. He can no longer create independently because he no longer has the Word. Only someone who was present at the creation can know it. Tubal-Cain knew it and gave it to Hiram. Whoever wants to regain the power of procreation must gain possession of the Word. The truly creative power must unite itself with the Word. The Word will bring forth the man of the future. Then the son of Hiram really will be seen. Fire, the divine power, will then establish itself in a new way. A new race will replace the old. In the ancient Hebrew language, there is a word, a mantra, which, it is said, will create the world if uttered sufficiently strongly. Man will thus beget spiritual man by means of speech itself, once the word has been developed sufficiently. Now we grasp what is represented by the tree of knowledge. The serpent is what winds itself upward in the backbone as spinal marrow. Perception in the physical is that kind of knowledge which originates in the nervous system. Quote, I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. Close quote. By that is meant enmity between the seed of the physical perception, and the seed of the spiritual perception. The spiritual, the woman, indeed bruises the head of the serpent, but only after it has wounded her in the heel. This is that power which presses against the foot of man from the center of the earth. The power of speech changes at man's puberty. This was regarded as a portent of the new son of Hiram, 2 Chronicles 2:13. The ideal which the Freemasons had set themselves was therefore to bring about the procreation of this son from the male sex, which is to result from the power of the larynx. Everything which subsequently appeared on the earth in physical form had its origin in the spirit. In the very beginning, the only things active on earth were those which originated from the divine spirit. There then appeared, on the one hand, the female image wisdom of the priests, and on the other the imageless wisdom of Cain. Now it is interesting that when an image content was sought for, the wisdom of Cain, the male wisdom then borrowed from the female wisdom. The temple legend and the entire content of Freemasonry derives from the old priestly wisdom, from the revelation from above. That was concealed in symbols. However, the symbols gradually ceased to be understood. Gradually everything occult vanished from Freemasonry. The 3 craft masonry degrees are oriented wholly toward the physical plane. Because we have seen why these spiritual currents run parallel to each other, we will now also understand the significance of the theosophical movement. It is preparing in the spiritual realm what will later happen on the physical plane, the reunion of the sexes. The divided wisdom must likewise flow together in the one divine wisdom. Through theosophical wisdom, a balance must be found in man between the religious, priestly wisdom and the wisdom of Freemasonry. The wisdom of the future must evolve out of the higher human, which lives equally in both male and female. To develop what is needed and what is completely uninfluenced by things of the physical plane is the purpose of the theosophical movement. Theosophy is truly male-female wisdom, wisdom which is equally valid for both sexes. Through the teaching of reincarnation, one recognizes that what comes to expression in every new earth life is not the personality of that particular earth life, but that the causal body, the entelechy, creates itself asexually. When we become aware of this, we are spiritually quickened with what is higher than the sexual, with what is independent of the causes of conflict between the two currents. Thus, theosophy is the balancing movement, and it alone can bring about the balance. Only in theosophy can one speak about an occultism that applies equally to both sexes. Only from this source can one think of a real balance between the two sexes. Everything else is an after effect of the previous dual sexuality. Freemasonry sets itself the task of preparing for the future. So the wholly exclusive principle of former times was abandoned as early as the 18th century. And in 1775, the first of the so-called adoption lodges were founded, a lodge for women, since the law of the balance of the sexes was recognized. And so the connection was established between men and women through the founding of a lodge for women. But every member of a woman's lodge had to be adopted by a man from a men's lodge. Indeed, H.P. Blavatsky belonged to such an adoption lodge. And so this theosophical experiment was made by Freemasonry itself. This shows you that whatever is correct is always preceded by an experiment. Only the reason why such an experiment is made may not be understood immediately. However, man can equally not expect that fundamental forces in the world will always be understood right away. It may be that one prefers one or the other current. Therefore, the two currents will run parallel to each other for a long time yet. In order to achieve a harmonious balance, it may be necessary to pour into Freemasonry what will lead it over toward the theosophical movement. Now, you will also grasp why in the Middle Ages the Church had to evolve a quite specific ideal. Freemasonry created its ideal for the future. The Church created its ideal for the future. It had nothing to do with Freemasonry. Christ lived in the Church as ideal, a male ideal indeed. This male ideal could not suffice for the occult current within the Church. Man needed the active as well as the passive principle. He had to think out what he lacked. He needed something that would complete him as a means of concentration. He was already a man. He had to add the woman to himself in thought. The occultist who understood something about this, who was not a Freemason, must conceive the woman. Thus did the cult of Mary spring out of monasticism. This came to the Church, to the priesthood, and to Freemasonry, that is, as a third current. All three currents had basically the same aim, to make mankind independent of the sexes. But the way of achieving this aim varied. The Christian occultist sought the male principle in woman, to embody it in himself. One has to be clear about the fact that the true inner man is independent of the sexes, which are divisive. That is why one passes through both sexes during different incarnations. And now you must consider that for Freemasonry the battle on the outer physical plane is waged so that all individualities which incarnate in female bodies are gradually led toward the male, so that the male lasts longer than the female. It should outlast the female because the female was the earlier one. This was in the back of the Masonic mind as an ideal, but it was one-sided. What ideal does Theosophy have in the back of its mind? The ideal of Theosophy is to use the wisdom that comes from higher planes to bring about on the physical plane itself a human race that is above sexuality. Therefore, Theosophy is indeed a wisdom that is not broken up into various religions, that does not rely on any particular religion, but falls back on the primal wisdom that made the world, that replaces that wisdom which, as priestly wisdom, was differentiated in the various wisdoms. It must do this, because in the course of time the priestly wisdom has completed its task. Theosophy, however, wants to conquer the future, to conquer what still has to come, rather than what has already been. It is, in a particular sense, a continuation of the ancient priestly wisdom, of the mysteries, and nevertheless, in another sense, is in contrast with them. Opponents of the Theosophical movement would be those who want to stick rigidly to the ancient priestly wisdom, who seek to retain it and, so to speak, mummify it in its old form. The plan of the higher worlds for world development is to guide evolution toward a modern spiritual life which will forge the future. The very first blush of the dawn of a new wisdom, which has to come, showed at the time when the Rosicrucians brought a new spiritual life to human development in the 15th century. This was a matter of a new impulse coming into the world. The theme of this was that the old priestly wisdom should be transformed into a new wisdom. Forces also existed that wanted to reconquer the world for the ancient priestly wisdom. An order was thus founded with the aim of winning the earth back for the old priestly wisdom. This order, the Jesuit order, chose the ideal male in contrast to the cult of Mary. It used occult powers to erect something like a dam to hold back the whole stream of independent life, and to conserve what seeks to cling to the cross. It championed the male principle, the cross by itself, without the roses. However, another order added roses to the cross, and new life sprang out of them. So we have two modern currents. The one has brought the old into the present and seeks to check progress with all its might. The other has surrounded the old cross with roses. It has grafted a new shoot, the cross entwined with roses. These two currents run parallel with each other, the one order having a cross without roses, and the other which reveres the roses on a new cross, which must come. These are the Rosicrucians. The Theosophical movement grew out of this current. It springs from the newly flourishing scion of the rose, which must mature in the future. Thus we have seen how this battle started, in which women were not allowed to play a part. Our task is to bridge the gulf between the Freemasons and the Rosicrucians. The work is difficult, but it must be done. It involves reaching toward the awareness of the higher humanity beyond sexuality. It is difficult to win through to that, but it is possible, and this will succeed. This will become reality.